So, welcome to this fourth video of the second course. Our theme today, the third precept. We could say it's sexual ethics, ethics around relationships and family. We're looking at some questions at least. Our first course, of course, was looking at the mind, working on the mind with the mind in meditation. Our second course, this course, is working on the mind in everyday life. Otherwise known as Buddhist ethics, of course, in a negative form. Abstaining from violence. Violence meaning not only physical violence, but emotional violence. The essence of violence being the domination of one ego by another. One ego forcing another ego to do what it wants them to do. The positive form, of course, is actions inspired by metta. Actions that express metta. Metta being like the sun that gives heat and light to encourage life and growth in the material universe. But not in a material universe, in a spiritual universe, encouraging spiritual life and spiritual growth. And as the English romantic poet Shelley said, the great secret of morals is love, going beyond our nature to identify with the good in others. And the first precept being at the heart of all the other precepts. The other precepts being more detailed workings out of this first precept. The second precept being the principle of love applied to possessions. Not only possessions, but other things like time and energy. Negatively, it's not taking what's not freely given. Positively, generosity or dana. Generosity being the fundamental Buddhist virtue. The fundamental way of going beyond our own ego when we give to others. Giving not to just our teachers, not just to others in a sangha, but to everyone, and feeling richer for it. So this is where we've been already. But before going into the specifics of this third precept, the area of sexual ethics, to some extent, relationship ethics, family ethics. Let's look at cultural influences. Cultural influences that distort our view of what ethics is in this area. This is a complex subject, not least because sexual craving is said to be the strongest craving. It's sexual activity. How we go about it profoundly penetrates into our cultures and religions, into our lives and relations, profoundly penetrates into our personal conditioning. So, in looking at the ethics of it all, we need to distinguish the influence, be clear about the influence, say, Christian values on this subject, or for those in India, Hindu values, or for those in the modern West, the influence of Western liberal values. So, in our Triratna culture, to examine a few attitudes, masturbation isn't considered a mortal sin. It could be the expression of positive sexual energy, the sexually neutral expression of positive energy. Or it could be a neurotic habit, neurotic behavior. Anti-Sangarachita define neurotic as wanting something from someone or something which, by their nature, they're not able to give us. That's how we define neurotic. Sex with contraception can be considered responsible sex. If you want to have sex without having a baby. Although abortion is considered violence to the unborn child, and so a breach of the precepts. Marriage is considered a civil partnership, but not a sacrament. So divorce is allowed. And there's no a priori restriction on sexual partners, who they are. Unlike, for example, in Hinduism, where you marry in your own caste. You don't marry outside your caste. And sex before marriage is frowned upon. So we've looked at a few attitudes that we can inherit from our society, our conditioning, which is useful to be aware of when looking at the subject of what really are sexual ethics. And a question for you to share in chat after the video. What are your attitudes and values in the sphere of sexual ethics? And what's their source? So, in Triratna, we've developed a culture around sexual relationships, a culture to support the individual in their spiritual development. We see the couple, ideally, as an interaction of two individuals. This means, of course, bringing our spiritual practice into our sexual relationships as well. Individuals, true individuals, being psychologically separate, in happy, healthy, psychologically independent states of mind, non-neurotic states of mind, not two merging into one, but individuals in sensitive, open, and honest communication. There's an absence of power mode within the relationship. Neither partner making decisions for the other, imposing their decisions on the other. They may come to an agreement or disagree. They can agree to disagree. And each setting their own priorities for their lives, rather than having priorities imposed upon them by others. Each keeping their individual responsibility. So being an individual in a couple is a high ideal. Also, sexual relationships not being at the center of the mandala. A mandala being a symbolic representation of all the aspects of your life and all your relations and priorities. What's most important comes at the center. What's less important is placed further away from the center. In sexual relations, moved away from the center, towards the edge. Especially example for those who live in spiritual communities. Long-distance relationships have become popular, where your partner is in another community, or maybe another town, or even another country. I know of at least one example where one's partner was in the other hemisphere. That's about as far as you can get. But for most, it would mean meeting at weekends or once a month. So a few words just to introduce our Triratna culture in the area of sexual relationships. Doing them in a way that helps the development of the individual. The question for you, what's at the center, near the center, and at the periphery of your mandala? And are there any changes you would like to make? So let's look at some common attitudes in Russian culture, where there are strong family values. I quite often hear people say that children are the greatest happiness. But are they the greatest happiness? They entail a lot of work. Succinctly, Buddhism teaches that the deepest and lasting happiness can only be found in the attainment of enlightenment. Buddhism also teaches the truth of impermanence. None of us can guarantee that we, or anyone dear to us, will still be alive tomorrow, which is a sobering thought. Buddhism also doesn't teach that the prolongation of the human race is the highest value. It also tells us that existence is possible without the body, which is represented by the God realm in the Tibetan wheel of life. This God realm, of course, being distinct from enlightenment. And are families the people you can trust most? Buddhism would say those you can trust the most are those who are committed to seeing things as they really are, to reality, to truth, to living by reality, abstaining from the power mode, overcoming egoism, and overcoming false speech. Meaning those who we can trust the most are those who are well on the spiritual path. Does true wisdom come from our ancestors? Or does true wisdom come from those who have seen things as they really are, who have seen reality, truth? Or at least those who teach the words of those who realize the truth. And does a woman need to have children to realize her potential? Buddhism would say that our true potential is realized only when we gain enlightenment. And are children made by parents, created by parents, belonging to parents? Again, no, Buddhism teaches that they who have become children chose their parents according to the law of karma, chose parents who corresponded to their state of consciousness at the last moment of their previous life. This is the implication of the Buddhist teaching on karma and rebirth. So our children, by nature, are independent of us, individuals in potential at least. Families tie up time and money and energy, which could be used for spiritual life and spiritual development. Although, if you already have children, bringing them up well, is the responsible and skillful thing to do. So some common Russian attitudes around the family and Buddhist responses to them. And a question for you: what's your attitude to family values? Do you find family values supportive or restricted, or a bit of both? So now we've looked at the cultural background, cultural context, let's turn directly to the precepts. The negative form of the third precept in English is undertaking to abstain from sexual misconduct. Undertaking to abstain from sexual misconduct. There isn't a satisfactory direct way of translating it into Russian. So we have two versions. Firstly, abstaining to cause harm in the sexual sphere. So the principle of non-violence, the absence of power mode in the sexual sphere, even the slightest manipulation to get what we want, for the more refined form of the precept. And secondly, avoiding irresponsible actions in the sexual sphere, meaning ignoring that actions have consequences, ignoring the great Buddhist truth that actions have consequences, and specifically, of course, ignoring that having sex leads to pregnancy. It might be interesting just to look at what the Pali Canon said about this precept. It was considered as abstaining from rape, adultery, and abduction. Rape, of course, being violence to the woman, having sex with the woman against her will. Adultery being violence to the partner, or the person engaged in sexual activity, and maybe violence to the family around the partner, meaning emotional violence, and probably deceit as well. Abduction isn't so common these days. Violence to the person being abducted and their family. We can include abortions, which are considered violence to the unborn child. The Buddhist teaching on rebirth implies that life starts with conception. And we can also add all forms of sexual manipulation and exploitation, all forms of emotional blackmail, pressuring somebody into having sex, or withholding sex unless we get what we want. So many different possibilities. But now we come to the positive precepts. What we try to develop in the space opened up with stillness, simplicity, and contentment. I purify my body. With stillness, simplicity, and contentment, I purify my body. There wasn't a straightforward translation into Russian here as well. So again, it might be useful to look at translations to clarify the meaning. The Russian version of the precept doesn't say stillness, but peacefully. There's no direct translation of stillness that have positive connotations. Don't just give a sense of being a corpse. The English word means without movement. Being still means not moving. So stillness refers to the body. When energy withdraws from outer activity, as we go into an inner experience, which is meditation, leaving us with a vibrant stillness, something more than just an absence of movement. And if we enjoy stillness, we'll naturally tend to simplify our lives. Simplicity arises when we don't need much in the outer world. Our material development becomes less important. Things like possessions, property, money, family, are kept to a minimum. So our lifestyle is simple, to give us more possibilities of stillness. This is beautifully evoked in the traditional image of a monk living with one robe and one bowl. And from the vibrant stillness of meditation, we also get contentment. Contentment from an inner life that gives meaning and richness. And our pleasure from both inner and outer experience becomes more intense. When we eat mindfully, for example, and really taste the food that we are eating, and spontaneous happiness can arise more and more frequently. So we've looked at what we're trying to do less of, to stop doing, and what we can do in its place. It's a good start, but there's further to go. Staying with the Pali Canon. The bhikkhus at the time of the Buddha, those who had gone forth from home to live as wandering ascetics, to be homeless, so as to be free to follow the teachings of the Buddha full time. practice more intensely. They practice what is called brahmacharya. Brahmacharya meaning abstention from sexual activity, being celibate. They're in no position to start a family, no position to take on family responsibilities, and there wasn't any contraception. So they had a stark choice: sex and the family, or celibacy. Question for you: how does brahmacharya sound to you? The liberation of something horrifying. But what does brahmacharya literally mean? Brahma is the highest of the gods, to whom the Brahmins of Indian society have a connection, claim a connection to. So we have Brahma, and Charya means faring in, travelling in. We could say being in the realm of Brahma. In a similar way, order members are called Dhammacharis or Dhammacharinīs, meaning faring in, travelling in, being in the Dharma, living in the Dharma, living in truth, living in reality. But brahmacharya is living in the realm of Brahma. But what's the connection between being celibate and being in the realm of the gods? In Indian mythology, the gods make love by looking at each other in the eyes. Or from another point of view, to explain it a little more, in states of higher meditative concentration, bodily awareness becomes peripheral. So we go beyond the polarization of male body and female body, beyond the polarization of male and female, temporarily at least. States of meditative concentration are an inner state, but they have an outer counterpart, which is the realm of the gods, the God realm, and the wheel of life, which we've already looked at. So forcing in brahmacharya, being celibate while being in states of meditative concentration, is considered like living in the God realm. That's the connection. In the modern Theravada, becoming an anagarika meaning homeless one, becoming an anagarika is a preparatory stage for becoming a bhikkhu. In Triratna, we also have anagarikas, but it's a little different. Becoming an anagarika is considered a lifelong commitment and only recommended for those who are very experienced, those who have been ordained a long time. Although it's not considered a higher ordination, it's considered a more intense practice of the Third Precept. And anagarikas can reside, as I know, in personal experience. As I said, an anagarika means being homeless. But it doesn't have to mean literal homelessness. You don't literally have to live on the streets. There's a spiritual meaning, a spiritual significance of being homeless. And this meaning is conveyed in the form of 5 characteristics of the anagarika, which we'll look at now. So, the characteristics of an anagarika. We'll start, of course, by looking at practicing brahmacharya, meaning being celibate, single, not engaging in sexual activity, and the absence of family responsibilities, potential or actual from actions in the past. Bhante Sangharaj taught that it's the practice of brahmacharya that makes somebody an anagarika. Brahmacharya is the essence of being an anagarika. But why is it such an important practice? Is it only about being free to live the spiritual life, having a bit more free time? Let's look at things in a little more detail. It's said, Buddhism teaches, that sexual desire, sexual craving is the strongest craving. And craving being one of the 3 poisons in the hub, in the center of the wheel of life. It's this sexual craving that leads to rebirth in our human form or elsewhere. And the full overcoming of this craving is called enlightenment. So it's a big deal. Overcoming this sexual craving is invariably a gradual path. And what are the first steps? You could say the first steps will be simple restraint and bringing some conscious control to our sexual activities. An example of this is, from a man's point of view, since I am one, I know my experience as one. We might see somebody who's attractive. We might feel pleasure from seeing them. We might take the next step and try to start talking to them, keep in contact with them. But we don't have to take that step. we can just stay and enjoy the pleasure we get from seeing them, and accept that this pleasure will pass. Easier said than done. Also try to see if we want to intensify the pleasure, or if we're happy with the pleasure at the level that it is. But there are other things. We can start withdrawing energy from the sexual sphere. The practice in the Pali Canon is called guarding the doors of the senses, reducing sexual stimulation. We could broaden this practice out and include reducing any stimulation that leads on to unskillful mental states. But also there's developing the ability to talk about our sexual experience, bringing consciousness, more awareness to our sexual experience. That can help as well. It's not an easy subject to talk about. To make our discussion a little easier, let's clarify a few terms, so it's easier to know what we're all talking about. Firstly, sexual energy. Secondly, sexual activity. Thirdly, sexual relationships. It's not a precise set of definitions, but enough to get a feeling of what we're talking about. Looking at what each term refers to in a little more detail. Firstly, sexual energy, referring to internal feelings and emotions. Feelings of being sexually aroused. Physical feelings. Feelings in the body when we're sexually interested. Energies flowing. But emotions as well. When we're in love. All the energy, all the emotions, all the imagination of being in love. This is all sexual energy. And secondly, sexual activity, meaning actions that lead to conception and birth, or actions similar to them. So we'll consider sex with contraception still as sexual activity. It's a useful distinction to make between sexual energy and sexual activity. For the reactive mind, one follows on from the other, if given the chance. But, as I already said, we can practice, leaving sexual energy as it is, without it leading on necessarily to sexual activity. Once we develop more pliability and awareness through meditation in our mind, So moving on from sexual activity to sexual relationships. Thirdly, meaning relationships with people engaged in sexual activity. People usually have sexual activity in established sexual relationships, but not always. These established sexual relationships usually have a clear start and finish. You decide to be in one, you decide to stop. But not always. It is possible to drift in and drift out. In sexual relationships, there's usually an agreement not to have sexual activity with others, not to be in sexual relationships with others, sometimes not to even experience sexual energy from others. Although there are open relationships which do allow for a wider scope, which do allow for sexual activity with others. And of course, sexual relationships may lead on to marriage and having children. So just a little analysis of some of the things we're talking about. Sexual relationships can be complex for various reasons. Might be worth touching on this point for a moment since we're in the vicinity. First of all, the simple fact that since sexual craving is said to be the strongest craving, well, there's a tendency to operate in power mode in such relationships, using power in whatever way is available. They can also be neurotic. You can be neurotically attached to our partner. Being neurotic means, of course, wanting something from them which they can't, by their nature, give us. For example, we want to feel loved, but we want to feel loved to compensate for our lack of self-love. So we look for that love from another person when we can only really create it. We can only really experience it from ourselves. Sexual relations also, I find, are often based on a common myth. You and I, fighting against the world. But when one person withdraws from the myth, stops believing the myth, the relationship can be over. Attachments can arise in other ways too. We all have different qualities. Men and women in particular might have different qualities. And we might start depending on qualities that we lack. One of us might be able to cook, the other can't. And they who can't cook wouldn't want to be independent, can't be independent because we depend on the ability of being cooked for. But if we find ourselves in that position, we can develop the ability ourselves and give us the option to be whole, independent, a truer individual, whether we stay in that relationship or not. Or maybe two people have children together, or just get settled together, and might not have the energy to break things up, even if the relationship has grown stale, with no real communication, no real energy in the relationship. It might just get to be too much of a comfortable habit that we don't have the energy to break. Another cause of complications is projection, something psychologists are all too familiar with. You project your own ideas onto the other person, and that hinders real communication. You start to have conversations with your own ideas in the other person, and not the other person in themselves. And what's worse, they might start doing the same to you. These projections might be quite negative. And worse still, you might believe them to be true, hindering the ability to know who you really are. It's worth saying that projections can be positive too. We might project our own unrealized positive qualities onto others. Might like somebody because they seem really calm, when we really need to develop calm in ourselves. We try and get this calm from another being, when what we really need to do is reclaim our projections, realizing that the calm that we see in another is our own quality of calm in a germinal form. If we see it, it's ours. It's part of us. If it wasn't part of us, we wouldn't see it. We wouldn't know it existed. So becoming aware of our projections and reclaiming them is a step in developing these qualities in ourselves and becoming whole and complete in ourselves, becoming an individual, that word again. So we look more at positive projections a little bit later, but we've had a little tour, a little analysis of these three levels of sexual engagement. Simple sexual energy, and the difference between it and sexual activity and sexual relationships, and some of the complications that can arise in them. So yes, not a little to say, coming out of the subject of brahmacharya. But it's always useful to look at the positive. We've already seen the positive aspect of this precept as practicing stillness, simplicity and contentment to help practice brahmacharya, we can also engage in nourishing activities of other kinds. Activities where we experience strong pleasure, strong emotion, and ideally refined strong pleasure and refined strong emotion. Some ways to do this. We can simply spend time in nature, getting out of our cities and our usual routines. We can enjoy beauty in music or art, and going to the theatre. Then there's deep, open, honest communication with spiritual friends. We'll talk more about this in the next course. And taking a step back as well, deepening our meditation experience. Sometimes deeper experiences arise spontaneously when we're simply being still and doing nothing, doing what we can to cultivate inner contentment, allowing the joy and happiness to arise. A question for you: which nourishing or refined strong pleasures and emotions do you enjoy? Which do you think you can start cultivating? But all of this might not be so simple. People are different. And sex, well, it's a complicated subject. It should be treated with respect. However, all of this, withdrawing attention, practicing some degree of conscious control, bringing awareness to the area through communication, and cultivating nourishing and more refined, strong experiences of our energy and emotions. All of this might not be enough. For some it might be, especially for those who've had a lot of sexual activity. The need might be simply to practice restraint. Well, for others, this isn't the case. As someone once said, we might realize that we simply poured concrete over the whole area of sexual energy and sexual activity, meaning we're not able to experience our sexual energy or not experience it in an uncomplicated manner because of unconsciously blocked energy for other reasons. In such circumstances, it might be helpful to free our sexual energies up in a mindful context. And since we're in the area, in the vicinity, it might be worth saying a word or two about tantric sex. I would say this is different from just allowing our energies to free up, which we've just looked at. I would say tantric sex is working with our sexual energies at a higher level, although it's often misunderstood. I would say, to be clear, if it involves normal sex, then it has nothing to do with tantric sex. Tantric sex is liberation of energies tied up with sex through meditation, which needs a foundation of restraint based on years of practice, years of meditation and years of ethical practice, sensitivity to others, the ability to not have sex when aroused, and the ability to really understand in our own experience, in our personal experience, what it means to liberate energies. So finally, I think we've got to the end of the point on brahmacharya. So let's look a little bit more briefly at the other characteristics of an anagarika. Well, secondly, there's fewness of possessions. The accumulation of material possessions ceases to be our goal. It allows us to give more time and energy to the spiritual life, as we've already looked at when discussing stillness, simplicity, and contentment. Then thirdly, there's simplicity of lifestyle. It goes hand in hand with fewness of possessions. Accumulating possessions necessitates a more complicated and busy life. Fewness of possessions and simplicity of lifestyle complement each other. And then fourthly, there's careerlessness, not having a career. Here, it's not so much not accumulating possessions, it's not accumulating reputation and status, not accumulating knowledge in a specific field. Instead, we focus our intellectual and creative energies on our spiritual lives. Let our spiritual lives be the expression of our intellectual and creative energies. And fifthly, the spiritual friendship, especially with those of your own sex. We often look to our sexual partner and family to be those that we really trust. But with our spiritual friends, we share an understanding of our unfolding inner lives, their richness and complexity, based on a shared Dharma practice and teaching. So our friends can naturally come to the center of the mandala of our emotional and intellectual lives. Friendship, of course, being friendship between two individuals or aspiring individuals, with all the qualities we've mentioned, being relatively free of projections, and in open, honest, real and sensitive communication. We'll look more at this in the third course. And a question for you: are you attracted to the ideal of an anagarika? Why or why not? And which qualities, which characteristics are most attractive, or which feel furthest away. So now, let's do a guided meditation with the theme of reclaiming our projections, reclaiming our positive projections. So, beginning the bolster behind my back to ensure a good posture. It's an essential first step of any meditation practice. Begin. Closing our eyes. We're ready to do so. And taking a moment just to listen to all the sounds around us. And bringing our attention now to our body, seated here. Allowing ourselves to relax. And feeling the warmth and light of our attention, of our awareness in our body. And to begin with, bringing our attention to our own positive qualities. What are positive qualities? You might need to deduce them. If you've given some time or money to somebody, Then be generous. And bringing to mind what our friends have said about us. Even if we didn't believe them. And now, bringing to mind a good friend, choosing a good friend. And what is it you like about them? Can you put it into words? And more precisely, what are their positive qualities? And now try being aware of their qualities independently of them. Let them separate out. And what would it feel like to have that quality yourself? how would you act if you had that quality? How would you act differently? And decide if you'd like to bring that quality into your life, so it becomes part of you. And how would you do it? And now, bringing to mind the neutral person, choosing the neutral person, someone you don't know very well. And what positive qualities do they have? It might be harder to see them since you know them less well. Maybe you can think of what their friends would find attractive, even if it doesn't appeal to you. And staying with a positive quality, and being aware of this quality independently from them. letting them separate out person and quality. And how would it feel like to have this quality yourself? How would you act? How would you act differently if you had this quality yourself? And decide if you'd like to bring this quality into your life. And now, bringing to mind a difficult person, an unpleasant person, an enemy, choosing somebody for this stage too. What are their positive qualities? This might be quite difficult to do. Maybe you don't see any qualities at all. Maybe you see their qualities as a threat, mixed up with threat. So it's hard to see quality and threat is different or distinct. but do what you can to see a positive quality in them. And trying to become aware of this positive quality, independent of them. That quality and person separate out. And how would you feel if you had this quality? How would you act? How would you act differently if you had this quality? And decide if you'd like to bring this quality into your life. And now bringing your attention back to your body, seated here. Listening to all the sounds around you. And when you feel ready, slowly and gently opening your eyes to finish the practice. So one last question for you. How did the meditation go? What was your experience of it? And time for a little resume. We've looked at some cultural attitudes to sexual ethics and family ethics, as well as a positive culture in Triratna for the development of the individual. We've looked at what to avoid in the area of sexual ethics and what to develop to be able to act more skillfully. And we've introduced a language to talk about our sexual experience, as well as a brief overview of psychological factors in our sexual relationships. And finally, what it means to be an anagarika, the different characteristics of one. The questions that we looked at are, what are our attitudes and values in the sphere of sexual ethics? What's at the center, in the periphery of our mandalas? And our attitude to family values, are they supportive or restrictive? How does brahmacharya sound to you? The liberation, something horrifying. Which nourishing, refined, strong pleasures and emotions do you enjoy? And are you attracted to the ideal of an anagarika? Any of the 5 qualities? Or which ones? And how was your guided meditation on reclaiming projections? Of course, there are many more questions that have gone unasked. Any of them, you're welcome to share in our chat, in our groups. And what to do in our everyday lives. Well, we can continue meditating daily, including looking to reclaim our positive projections and finding ways of avoiding unskillful actions and developing skillful actions in our everyday lives, the area of sexual ethics and the family, and relationships. I'll resist the temptation to be any more specific. I'll leave it to you to decide how. And we'd be interested to hear what you decided. And just to let you know, in the next video, we'll move to the area of truthful speech. So I wish you contented, still and relaxed week or two before the next video, before we see each other here again.